Good evening, everybody. My name is Heidi Agler. I am with a consulting firm called Root Policy Research, and I've been assisting the city with the Home in Tacoma project over the last 6 to 8 months. We do have a couple other people. It looks like people are still coming into the room for the waiting room. So we're going to do a little bit of some a conversation through some polling. I want to let everybody know that the PowerPoint that you see running here gives some background information about the Home in Tacoma project. We will go through this information in depth as we go throughout the meeting tonight. And for those of you who need interpretation, please hit the interpretation button and you will be put into a comparable room where we'll be having the same conversation, but that information will be provided in Spanish.
Para escuchar en vivo a la intérprete en español, presione el botón Interpretation.
Thank you so much. I also want folks to know we'll be using the Q&A this evening to collect your comments. So if you have a comment or a question, please go ahead and use the Q&A. That will give us, and I'll be watching that closely, that'll give us a heads up that you have a comment or a question. We'll mostly be using that for discussion. But before we jump in, we're going to do a little bit of a poll. So we'd like to know how to tailor this meeting to your thoughts, your what you need in terms of information about the Home in Tacoma project. You should be able to see on your screen something called a poll with a Home in Tacoma banner at the top. We're going to walk through this initially, and then we'll get started with the presentation. I do want to take a moment and say that our objective tonight is to hear from you. So this is an information session. We are leading up to a city council meeting, which will happen on the 13th of July. I want to remind folks, and you'll see this on a slide too, so don't feel like you need to hurry and write this down, that your comments about the Home in Tacoma project will be due on July 13th at 4 p.m. to the city clerk, leading up to a meeting with city council about this project that same evening. But before we dive in, we'd like to know a bit about how you're thinking, how you're feeling about this project, how you're feeling about the opportunity for missing middle housing. And so this first question is, what benefits of infill housing do you think are most important, both to yourself and to the city of Tacoma? You should be able to pop right in and respond to this poll on your computer. Your options are increasing variety in housing types and price points, creates potential to generate rental income, promotes aging in place or housing for family members. More people can find housing near jobs, transit, shopping, schools, and parks. Reduces car dependency in walkable neighborhoods. New homes bring diversity and vibrancy to neighborhoods, or creates jobs and supports local business. So if you have a moment, go ahead and participate in that poll. And I'll ask my colleague here, Mary, to show us the results of that once folks get a chance to participate. Mary, I don't know if you can show us the results of that poll yet.
So I have to end it to be able to show it. And right now
we need to go through.
About 20% have voted.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead for the benefits of folks who are on the phone. I'm going to go ahead and read through the remaining questions here. For the first question, the other options were to help protect Pierce County farms and forests, as well as reducing gentrification. Question 2, if you are still working your way through the poll, what potential concerns do you have about infill housing? Options are new houses could be taller or closer together and not fit closer together than nearby houses. Design may not fit the character of the houses. Existing viable houses might be demolished. Infill might make housing less affordable or cause displacement. New housing could reduce available on-street parking and increase street traffic. Green spaces, yards, and tree canopy could be lost. Infill may impact my property value or taxes, or it may overburden schools and services. The remaining questions for those of you who are on the phone or interested in knowing what this poll's about, what's your overall impression of the Home in Tacoma project recommendations? They're on the right track, they need substantial changes, or maybe you're undecided and that's why you're here with us this evening. And then last but not least, we'd love to know what questions you have about this project. So that last question, question 4, if you haven't filled out any others, please fill that one out. We'd like to know if you're worried about the pace of growth, design controls, transitions between lower and higher scales, reuse of existing buildings, infrastructure and services, transportation choices, ownership opportunities, affordability and displacement tools, trees and open space, and any others you can type. Go ahead and type in the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn the poll over to Mary to show us what answers we might have here.
Give me one moment to end that poll and to share those results.
And it looks like a few of you may have had a little bit of trouble taking the poll. I'll go ahead and make sure that you please feel free to put your responses in the Q&A and we will monitor those. And then we'll make sure that you have more of an option to contribute as we go throughout this evening. So in addition to, so Mary here on your screen, for those of you who can see us on the screen, I'll read these out, the responses out for those of you who are on the phone. We look at the potential benefits of infill housing that are most important. Most folks said increases in the variety of housing type as well as promoting aging in place, very important. What potential concerns do you have about infill housing? The highest proportion here was new housing could reduce available on-street parking or increase street traffic. So a lot of concerns about parking. Secondary concerns, but not far behind, were green spaces, yards, and tree canopy getting lost, as well as infill overburdening schools or services. In terms of the overall impression of the Home in Tacoma project recommendations, about half of you think that it needs substantial changes, 14% on the right track, and 37% are undecided. And then when we're thinking about questions that you all would like to have answered or addressed this evening, the top response is design controls, followed by trees and open space, affordability, anti-displacement tools, infrastructure, and services. And I want to make sure those of you who put questions in the chat or comments in the chat, we'll certainly give you the opportunity, if you couldn't participate, to add information into the Q&A, excuse me, not the chat, Q&A later today. I do want to call out that there is another answer, a concern about the large number of people on disability payments who are trying to afford housing. And would this plan address that type of situation? Wonderful. So we'll go ahead and jump right in to the presentation. We're going to close the poll. Before we jump in, I want to do a couple of introductions. The folks who you're going to be hearing from most tonight include Jacques Colomb. He is with the City of Tacoma. Andrew Strobel, who is a planning commissioner, and Elliot Barnett, who is also with the City of Tacoma. And I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Jacques.
Thanks, Heidi. My name is Jacques Colon, and I am the Tacoma 2025 Strategic Manager for the City of Tacoma. For those of you that don't know, Tacoma 2025 is the city's strategic plan as developed by City of Tacoma residents. And one of the key strategies that we have undertaken to ensure that we reach the goals that the community has laid out in Tacoma 2025 is the Affordable Housing Action Strategy. And so I work with our staff on implementing the Affordable Housing Action Strategy, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute after Elliot and Andrew introduce themselves. Thank you, Heidi.
Elliot, why don't you go next, and then we'll conclude with Andrew. We'll do a quick video, and then we'll kick it right back to Jacques.
Hey everyone, I'm Elliot Barnett. I'm a planner with the city's Planning and Development Services Department, and I'm the project lead for the planning process for Home in Tacoma. And so I've been involved in the public engagement from day one. So I'm really thrilled to see all the participation here. This is great. And I've also been the staff support with the Planning Commission and helped them to refine the recommendations, which have now been forwarded on to the City Council. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew Strobel. I am a planning commissioner for District 1 that represents the West End. I volunteer my time on the Planning Commission, and I've heard a lot of your all's testimony and read a lot of your testimony regarding the Home in Tacoma project. And you know, I'm excited to be here and listen to you all tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So very quickly, I'm going to show a brief video and then I'm going to turn it over to Jacques for the beginning of our presentation. A number of you have joined since we started our conversation. So just a couple of housekeeping items. Please put any comments, any contributions in the Q&A. So that's where you should put your comments. I will prompt you to do that. And I promise that I will reflect those comments as we go throughout the presentation this evening. A couple of you have your hands raised. If you wouldn't mind putting your questions in the Q&A, that is the easiest way for us to respond to those. So I'll keep an eye on those and offer any clarifications. We're going to go through a presentation after we watch a quick video, and then we'll get your comments. So the bulk of our meeting tonight is to hear from you. I'm going to just pop up a little quick video here, which is also on the Home in Tacoma. I think many of you are familiar with the project website. If you're not, please Google it, Home in Tacoma. It's a very, very nice web page. And last but not least, I just want to remind people that public comments leading up to a council hearing next week, July 13th, those are due the July 14th to the city clerk before 4 p.m. and the city council meeting will also take place on July 13th. Depending on what the order of items are, just keep an eye on the agenda for what time this project will appear on their agenda. So here we go. We're going to watch. Oh, hang on just a moment.
And it's July 13th is the key date. I think
July 13th. Sorry, did I say the 14th?
in there.
I apologize.
Everybody, yeah, 13th is the date to keep in mind.
13th, everybody. So let's go ahead and watch a quick video, and then we'll jump right into the presentation.
People in Tacoma of all ages and incomes deserve the opportunity to
Heidi, when you muted yourself, it muted the video as well.
design of our neighborhoods while helping us thrive now, in a decade, and beyond. Learn more at cityoftacoma.org/homeintacoma.
All right, well, Jacques, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you to get us started on tonight's meeting.
Thank you, Heidi. So as we begin the conversation tonight, I will just let you know, based on the comments, I see a lot of you felt like the questions in the opening poll were biased. You can rest assured that those poll results will not be used for anything so much as an opportunity for us to engage you in the conversation tonight. So please don't feel like we were biasing the questions to get some kind of poll results. Those won't be used for anything. So again, my name is Jacques Colon. I'm the Tacoma 2025 Strategic Manager. And really, we can't talk about Home in Tacoma without talking about the housing crisis that our region and our city is facing right now. So we're going to talk about that. But before we do, a few logistics about tonight. In terms of our objectives for tonight's discussion, we really want to make sure that we're able to answer as many of your questions as possible and make sure that we are all working off of the same information about what this proposal is and what this proposal is not. And that's to really help us prepare for the big day, which is July 13th, where public comment to City Council will be happening at that hearing. And so as you heard Heidi say, if you want to get involved in other ways or learn more, please go to cityoftacoma.org/home in Tacoma. And logistics for this meeting today is you'll notice at the bottom of your screen that there is a Q&A button. It should be in the middle of the screen at the bottom. And so if you have a question for any of the panelists, please click on that button at the bottom of the Zoom window, open that and type in your question and make sure you hit send. And again, we're going to try to answer as many as we can today. I mentioned July 13th as a big date to keep in mind. Let me give you a few of the other dates that the project schedule is going to have. On May 19th, the Planning Commission gave their final recommendations to Council. And from June to July, notification and engagement has been happening. On July 13th, as we've mentioned, the Council will be holding their public hearing on the Home in Tacoma project. And 1 week after that, the Council will be convening for a special committee of the whole to discuss what they heard at the public hearing and next steps for the project. From July to September, the Home in Tacoma project recommendations will be going to Council committee for review based on public hearing. And that is in anticipation of the Council's request to take action by fall of 2021. So all of these actions and timetables are in service of leading up to Council taking action on a potential proposal in the fall. And you'll hear more about this, but all of this is within the scope of phase 1 of Home in Tacoma. And simply put, phase 1 is the vision of what could be. It's the opportunity for Council to vote on a vision for what could be when we talk about housing planning for the future of the city. Home in Tacoma phase 2 will happen after that, and it will most likely take roughly a year in time, but that timeline is still to be determined. And phase 2 is when a lot of the details, i.e. specific zoning changes in particular neighborhoods, specific affordability incentives being written in, design review implementation, all of those details are going to be worked into the Home in Tacoma phase 2 that will happen after fall of 2021. All of this information is available for you to see on that website. Again, cityoftacoma.org/home in Tacoma if you wanted to see that in more detail. Now, stepping back for a second, I mentioned that we can't talk about this project without talking about the housing crisis that we're facing. And one of the things that needs to be clear is that the housing crisis takes many forms. And what I mean by that is there is an affordable housing crisis, what some might call low-income housing. But in addition to an affordable housing crisis, there is a housing affordability crisis. And that's a little bit different because in addition to lower income housing having too little of a supply and prices being too high for people's incomes, we also have seen in recent years that for middle-class Tacoma residents and those in upper middle-class price brackets, those folks are having more and more trouble finding houses that meet finding housing that meets their lifestyle needs, finding housing that meets their cost needs so that they're not cost burdened, and finding it in places that's connected for them to opportunities in terms of jobs and education. And so in addition to an affordable housing crisis, we also have a housing affordability crisis across all economic spectrums in the city. One of the main reasons that we are having this housing affordability crisis across all income levels is really because supply is not keeping pace with demand. And in addition to supply not keeping pace with demand, incomes are not keeping pace with the rising costs of mortgages, home prices, and rents. So that's a bad equation when you talk about housing outcomes for Tacoma residents at large across the city, across all economic levels. So while no one solution can fix what is an incredibly complex housing crisis, we know that the crisis cannot be solved if we don't take bold steps to address the supply side gap that we see across all income levels in Tacoma. Now, in addition to that supply side problem, we also have to acknowledge that housing helps meet multiple other goals in Tacoma 2025, such as vibrant, walkable, and livable neighborhoods, workforce housing. Those are folks that we've talked about as first responders, nurses, teachers, people that really make a lot of the fabric that holds Tacoma together. So our workforce increasingly needs more places at different price points to meet their housing needs. Additionally, a lot of our Tacoma residents are wanting to age in place and stay in the communities that they have really built their community, and to do that, we need more options so that people don't have to stay in necessarily a 2,500 square foot single family home when that's not the need that they have at that point in their life. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we are creating pathways to access opportunity for all Tacoma residents, also creating pathways to financial stability, and really making sure that we're growing in the right places. And what I mean by that is we know that cities are the right place for the growth that we know that our region is going to see. And Tacoma needs to take steps through this project, whether it's the proposal that's before council or a proposal that is changed based on community's feedback about what needs to change for it to work best for everybody. We do know that the city is growing and that we need to think about how to do that in the best way for Tacoma residents. So moving on, I quickly want to mention that when we talk about the Home in Tacoma project, we are talking about increasing housing supply, choice, and affordability across multiple income levels. I mentioned that this is not the silver bullet or only solution to fixing the housing crisis, and that's very true. This will not be effective at solving all of the problems, and that's why we have an affordable housing action strategy that looks to leverage many, many different actions aimed at different parts of the housing crisis to ensure that we get the best outcomes for all Tacoma residents possible. And just a couple of those are looking at ways to leverage our publicly owned land for affordable housing, increasing first-time homebuyer programs to make sure that we're creating home buyers that are new home buyers that are creating new levels of stability in neighborhoods and in individual lives. Increasing diverse housing types, which is really what this Home in Tacoma project is aimed at doing. And then also establishing dedicated sources of funding for the Tacoma Housing Trust Fund, which for those of you that have been paying attention, Council recently passed House Bill 1590's tax to create new sources of funding for the lowest income folks and their housing needs. But in addition to that, we also need to make sure that existing housing stays affordable and in good repair. And we have to find ways to help people stay in their homes and communities while reducing barriers for people who often encounter them. So there has to be a lot happening in partnership with the Home in Tacoma recommendations to get all of the outcomes that we want to see for the most vibrant Tacoma possible. So just a moment to talk about actions to support lower income households in particular, for those of you that are interested in that aspect of this. Missing middle actions are most going to affect moderately affordable households. So it most likely will not be the action that has the biggest effect on the deepest levels of affordability, but overall supply will keep costs lower than they would be otherwise and introduce more choice that currently may not exist in the market. But in addition to that, some of the things that we are also looking at in partnership with this project are how we expand and target affordability incentives, such as bonuses and the multifamily tax exemption, how we expand and target inclusionary zoning requirements, if at all, how to establish and implement anti-displacement strategies to ensure that new development doesn't come at the cost of current residents, and also continuing to implement the full range of affordable housing action strategy actions, many of which I listed there. So thank you for allowing me to take a minute to talk about this, this subject. We really look forward to hearing more from you later on in this meeting. But for now, I want to pass it to Andrew Strobel, who has been representing the Planning Commission to talk you through some of the Planning Commission's vision and thought process and the recommendation that they ultimately landed on. So Andrew, thank you.
Thanks, Jacques. As Jacques said, I'll be presenting some of the perspectives of the Planning Commission and the public testimony that we heard during our hearing process and our public outreach process. As part of our job as citizen volunteers, we help make recommend decisions for the City Council, and we listen to the public, and that is part of our decision-making process. And so I just wanted to start with that as far as the amounts of testimony that we've received from folks, that, you know, certainly is listened to and considered as part of the Planning Commission, and hopefully I'll be able to explain some of our reasoning for our recommendation to the City Council today. When the Planning Commission was presented with the Home in Tacoma project, one of the overarching themes we found was based on the future growth in the region. Tacoma also needed to grow if it plans on remaining an affordable location for people and families of all ages and income brackets. Not building any housing would likely have consequences to the city's overall affordability and displace many people. It's in that theme that Tacoma needs some amount of growth to deal with the anticipated growth in the region, and in that the Home in Tacoma project was born. In order to keep pace of our region's growth, the city's target is to achieve about 55,000 housing units by 2040. Our existing multifamily is predominantly in growth centers like downtown Tacoma Mall, but also in neighborhood centers throughout the city, as you can see on this map. 75% of the city's residential area is exclusively single-family detached housing. And there are only a few areas where any mid-range density for housing even exists. Next slide, please. When the commission looked at Home in Tacoma, we saw that there was a need for a deeper dive into these mid-range densities and where they exist. There were only a few places throughout the city that you can predominantly find them. But what exactly is missing middle housing? As you can see from this chart, there's a wide range from your typical duplex all the way up to stacked triplexes and live-work mixed-use types of housing and everything in between. These uses are more common in older parts of the city, like the historic slope, but were prohibited throughout much of the city in the 1950s. From much of our public testimony and our public hearing, we established that there was renewed interest to explore, re-explore missing middle housing to allow for more diverse housing and control the affordability crisis we are experiencing, and also to support walkability in our neighborhoods throughout the city. Next slide. As part of looking at this project, the Planning Commission had several public engagement events and hearings to take public comment and testimony on the project. Personally, this is one of the largest participatory projects I've been part of since I started serving on the Planning Commission 4 years ago. The city conducted surveys, virtual housing cafes, city council comments, the participation in the Affordable Housing Action Strategy meetings, the Housing Equity Task Force, comment at the Planning Commission, stakeholder and community meetings. Comment was about, and other types of comment. Over 80,000 letters to community and stakeholders were sent to notify the public of this project. And we also had on the commission at least 1,000 pages of written public comment from the community. What the Planning Commission largely heard was, one, Tacoma is experiencing a housing crisis, and we need to address that through this project. And two, that there was broad support for the city to use and exercise affordability tools to support the Home in Tacoma project. And three, many, but definitely not all, were open to some version of diverse housing types in the missing middle and the lower scale. And four, there were concerns about neighborhood impacts. Impacts like design and scale, growth supporting infrastructure and services, and avoiding unintended consequences like demolition of historic properties, displacement, and loss of open space. Slide. After we considered public input, the Planning Commission made some changes to the overall package of items recommended to the City Council. Based off of feedback, we went through several iterations of where growth would occur. We reduced the mid-scale housing, and the overall scenario map was one of those changes. We recommended limiting height to 3 stories in most of the mid-scale areas, but 4 stories near centers and corridors. Both the commission and the public was very concerned about design and suggested strengthening infill design principles to reflect scale and elements of the scale and elements of neighborhoods. Like I had mentioned previously, there were concerns about demolitions of historic structures. We sought, as part of the commission recommendations, to promote the reuse of existing buildings as part of the proposal. There were many comments on affordability and displacement. As part of our recommendations, we sought to promote small and attached units, allow for affordability incentives, if not make them required in certain instances, and have the city come up with an anti-displacement strategy. As you can see, there's much developed coming in the Planning Commission's recommendations. We know that the devil is in the details. That's why, as part of our recommendations, we sought to have a second phase be a robust public process where we discuss those details more in more depth. And with that, I want to hand this over to Elliot.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. Elliot here. I'm going to take us through the rest of the slides here. I promise that there are more pictures coming up here for everybody, and also we wanted to structure this so that someone coming to this project kind of for the first time would still get the background, still get an introduction, but there is new material that we put in here to try and answer some of your questions, and lots of emphasis on design and scale, because we did hear that that's a big deal to everybody. So I'm going to run through a few more things. Thanks for bearing with us, and then we'll get to the fun part, which is your questions. So what's in phase 1, the package that the City Council is considering right now? Jacques and Andrew have already covered that it's this vision and policy. It's this decision about, is Tacoma going to change its housing growth vision? It's sort of founded on this idea that the current housing rules do place some limitation on supply, affordability, and choice. And should that really be the case? Is that really responding to people's needs as well as it can? So the basic idea here is that if council adopts the package as it is, it'd be a statement that we're moving away from exclusive single-family zoning, and we're shifting to this emphasis on design and scale citywide, that a structure, as long as it's about the right size, about the right design, could potentially have more than a single housing unit within that building footprint. There's also support for mid-scale housing in areas near shopping and transit. There's a commitment here to design standards, design and other standards before any of the zoning would change. So this is a yes, but only if statement that the Planning Commission has provided to the City Council at this stage. So nothing would change until council is satisfied that the range of commitments that are part of this package to get growth right have been met. And the package also calls for strengthening our tools to promote affordable housing. There's various ways the city can do that in partnership with development. And finally, updating our policy guidance to reflect what we've heard and what we have heard from our City Council, that affordable housing, anti-displacement, and anti-racism are all important policies that we need to reflect in our housing. So that is what Council will be discussing over the next few months. And if Council moves forward and adopts some changes to those policies, they would also initiate phase 2, which is zoning changes. So I'm sure most of you are aware that we have a housing growth scenarios map, which I'll show you in a second here. Well, again, that only is a framework, but the zoning changes are actually the rules about what can be built where. So that would be discussed. And there are lots of ranges of refinements and choices that the City Council can make as part of phase 2. Design standards is going to be a huge part of that. And then a range of actions that are really needed to support housing growth. the Planning Commission heard loud and clear that infrastructure, parking, concerns about the demolition of existing houses, green, sustainable, and resilient housing, and other important goals, they all need to be part of this package. And only when the city has figured out how to balance all those goals should the zoning actually be changed. So big part of this is in changing our current single family zoning, which is all about 1 unit per lot, 1 unit per house, to a concept of low scale, which emphasizes instead the size and the layout and the kind of residential patterns of each structure. So in this pretty famous graphic here from missingmiddle.org, the colored houses are infill, where you can see that they're about generally the scale and size of houses around them, but they contain more than a single unit. So that is the low scale concept. The medium scale concept, or mid-scale, supports more housing in areas where people could be living either without a car or with limited use of cars, in areas where they can walk to lots of things they need in daily life. And structures would be somewhat larger and create more housing in those walkable areas. So the proposal further delineates that we have several different housing types that would now be allowed either citywide in the case of low scale housing, or in certain mid-scale areas that are close to that shopping and transit. And this slide here shows kind of the range there. And but in each case, rather than exclusive single family, there would be a range of different housing types. By the way, detached houses are encouraged, allowed, and supported throughout these areas. There's nowhere in this proposal that detached houses are expected to go away. In fact, the proposal also looks at changing standards to make it possible to have some infill of detached houses into our existing neighborhoods too. So you're probably aware that the Planning Commission developed a couple of housing growth scenarios maps early on in February of this year. And the difference there was how much low scale and how much mid scale was going to be designated. So those maps went out. We got lots and lots of comments on the maps. And the commission took that input and developed the recommended scenario, which you see a still version of the map here on the screen. And so this is really a hybrid that the commission developed. They wanted to make sure that there was a mix of housing scales in every neighborhood of the city, because in some of the earlier versions, there was a lot of mid-scale in a certain neighborhood, but less in other areas. So they tried to balance that out. They also tried to make transitions at streets. And so you'll see that the lines sometimes move and they don't just go straight up and down parallel to a corridor. But the colors here again mean yellow means low scale and pink means mid-scale. And the shift that's happening here is that of these areas now, about 90% is single family and 10% is already multifamily low. So under the proposal, you'd get to low scale being about 60% and mid-scale being about 40% of those residential areas. So this still map, we know you can't see this. So there's an interactive map on the project webpage. So go check that out. You can plug your address in, and you can also see the factors that the Planning Commission considered in making these maps. And you can even see the earlier scenarios by clicking things on and off there. So those are the mid-scale and the low-scale proposals. Not without strong design is the message of this package. So what is missing middle housing design and scale? So here you see words on the screen. I've got pictures to follow this up in a moment here, but it's about being pedestrian oriented. It's about having consistent massing with the neighborhood around it, compatible design language and residential patterns, smooth transitions, not having a 4-story building next to a 1-story building and having it be a really abrupt transition. There are design tools that we can use to break up the appearance of density, like by breaking up the building footprint and setbacks, integrating shared spaces, cars tucked behind, strong encouragement of reusing existing structures rather than demolishing them. So those are the missing middle design principles that are part of this package, only if these principles can be met through strong design standards would the city change the zoning in the ways that we're talking about. And the commission also recognized that neighborhoods are completely different across the city. In some areas of town and in our older areas, you may have, smaller blocks with alleys and kind of a traditional neighborhood pattern. In others, that may have been built post-war eras, you have a totally different pattern. You may have 1 to 2 story structures with front-loaded garages and things like that. So this map here shows that we have a sense of that already, that there are different scales and different designs throughout the city, and that this is not one size fits all, that as part of phase 2, the design standards need to reflect that existing character and existing scale of each neighborhood, as you can see a couple examples here on the slide. So standards are also going to require compatibility with residential patterns. Well, what do we mean by that? So here you've got a graphic that shows a duplex or triplex. But how does this match residential patterns? Well, it's got a front yard and a rear yard. There's space between the house and the house next door. The height of the structure and the width of it are about the same as the houses around it. You got a larger building in front and a smaller one in back. Cars are tucked behind. You've got walkways connecting. And last but not least, you've got trees and vegetation as part of every site. So this is a 2 or 3 family or 2 or 3 unit building that reflects the patterns of our mostly single family neighborhoods. Another example, here you've got a picture of a cottage development where you have several units either attached or detached, but they're clustered around a common open space. This is another traditional pattern that I know you've come across in neighborhoods around the city. Well, once again, there's front yards. There's a shared space here in this case, but we have setbacks. People have been concerned that buildings would be built right on the property line. Absolutely not. There would need to be separation between each of the new housing types and the houses next door. From the street, the buildings are about the size, height, and width of houses. And again, trees and vegetation and walkways. One last example, and this would only apply to the proposed mid-scale areas. It's on the big end of the proposals. So a medium multifamily building, here this is a 3-story structure. It's wider, it's about maybe as wide as 2 lots, but it still has a front yard, side yards, and some space as a rear yard. So this is definitely a scale increase as compared to a house, but it still tries to echo the patterns of our predominantly single family neighborhoods around it. So this is what we mean by residential patterns. What does incompatible look like? Well, I took a couple of snapshots in some of my recent travels of missing middle housing types. This is a 4-plex on the left here and probably a 3 or 4-plex on the right, but these would be incompatible in terms of their design with the Home in Tacoma design principles. Why? Well, because on the example on the left here, while the scale might be about right for a single family neighborhood, it's clearly just auto-oriented with just those front doors or front garages facing the street and doesn't really respond to the character of the neighborhood around it. The example on the left is just big, built right up to the street and really overshadows the neighborhood next to it. This is not the vision. And I know that it's easy to picture kind of what could be a bad outcome. These would be bad outcomes in terms of compatibility. So what does compatible look like? So here we're showing you a few hypothetical buildings where you see a range of different housing types, such as townhouses, duplexes, a small multifamily project, perhaps a 6-plex here. So we would call these as generally compatible with residential character, Why? Because they have front and side yards. The height is about the same as houses around it. The rhythm along the street, even on buildings that are a little wider than a single family house, still continues the pattern of single family houses. So that's what we would generally mean by compatible. Those are some examples. The bottom right here, this is not a compatible transition. We know that people have really been worried about the idea of a 4-story structure. So that's why the commission was very careful about that and said only in the right place. So this would not be the right place because this would be a very abrupt transition from a 4-story structure down to a 1-story house next door. So that is not consistent with the vision. A 4-story structure could only take place where it was next to another large structure or across the street from a denser development pattern. So how is this going to play out over time? A very common question. The short answer is we don't know how long it will take for development to take place. And actually, that's really going to depend on phase 2, on the standards that the community develops there. But we do know that the vision is that over time, you would see some infill and you'd see buildings get a little bit bigger in the low scale areas, but still they would be about the size and scale of houses. And so the yellow indicates new backyard cottages, new 2-family, 3-family, or or slightly larger. But at the end of the day, the neighborhood is still fairly similar to what it is today, but a little denser, and a few more people can live there. Similarly, in mid-scale residential areas here, again, the neighborhood today is probably primarily houses. Well, over time, that neighborhood might change and you would see a slightly larger scale of structure go in. But at the end of the day, the vision is to have a mix of housing scales and types. Even in the mid-scale area, the difference is that you would have a slightly higher end of structures, which could be as tall as 3 stories or perhaps 4 in limited circumstances. So those, we wanted to try to answer questions that we know people have been asking about design. And so I hope that those pictures help, and I know we'll be getting lots more questions. Lastly, what's in the package? The Housing Action Plan is the study of housing needs that sort of underpins these recommendations. The really significant part is the comp plan policy changes, which actually do change the growth strategy and the associated policies for design. There's also some near-term code changes, which are changes that are consistent with actions the council's already taken. Things like removing some barriers for accessory dwelling units and creating a couple of new affordable housing bonuses to add to the package that we already have. Lastly, the SEPA determination, that's an environmental review that looked at how is this housing going to actually impact the neighborhoods? How are we going to handle it in terms of infrastructure? How are we going to prevent demolitions, etc.? So the SEPA is a commitment that the city will take care of those issues prior to making zoning changes moving forward. So take a look at that document as well when you have time to look at the webpage. So our ask here is absolutely, your voice in this process. We believe in finding common ground that's going to meet the majority of, or the needs of the majority of people of our community. We want to try to find ways to address concerns. We've heard that there are concerns, and it is a significant change to the housing growth strategy. So please collaborate with us by providing that input. And it would go now at this stage to the city council via the city clerk, and July 13th is that critical date. All the details of how you provide comment are available on that Home in Tacoma webpage, so you don't need to jot this down. Lastly, this is not the end of public engagement. If council moves forward, they will be starting another round of public engagement, and we really want your input if and when council decides to move forward with that. So that's it for our slides. I hope that we kept your attention. It's a little hard to tell in Zoom meetings here. And I pasted the question from our initial poll about what questions you have about the low scale residential proposals. We did want to try to create a little bit more focus on low scale areas so that people could come here tonight and, say, okay, oh, I'm in one of these proposed low scale areas. What does that mean to me? That doesn't mean we won't also talk about the mid scale, but we're going to kind of try to address low scale questions first. Thursday, we'll do the same, only we'll focus primarily on the mid scale. So participate in both. They're both going to be posted online as well. But in looking at the questions that you posed, top question that almost everybody had was about design controls. So we anticipated that. We know that's a big concern for people. And I hope that we answered some of your questions in that presentation. I know we'll get more. We see questions about pace of growth and how are we going to handle transitions. Infrastructure is another really big one. Trees and open space is another really big one. So with that, I want to stop talking and let Heidi take the reins here again and start posing questions to the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Elliot. I appreciate the presentation from Jacques, Andrew, and Elliot. And I've been scrolling through the Q&A. Thank you, everybody. We've got about, goodness, over 100 questions that have been posed. For those that have more of a technical response or your answer could be answered through some of the analysis that has already been done, I went ahead and answered those. So you can see those answered in the answered sections with links to websites. But for those, and I have been intentionally grouping the questions that I have to the panel, taking your questions and grouping those. So I'm not going to read the questions one by one because we don't have quite enough time to do that, but I will reframe them and present them to the panel. So I first want to talk a little bit about timeline. Elliot, Jacques presented the timeline going forward and how to comment. You can find all of that information on the website as well. There is one question about how long this proposal has been active. So it feels potentially a little rushed. So Elliot, if you could speak to when the city started this project and some of the meetings that have been, that have led up to this point.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'll take that one. So stepping back a little bit, the city has been working on housing choices, on infill housing, actually for quite a few years. If you'll recall, a few years ago, the city council decided to allow detached accessory dwelling units in backyards citywide. That was a significant change that had been several years in the works. Council also stood up a residential infill pilot program to try some of these missing middle housing types on a limited basis. So there've been steps over many years, but they really accelerated with the Affordable Housing Action Strategy. 2018 called for expanding our housing choices as one of its big priority actions. And so the Planning Commission and city staff, we really started in early 2020. We sent out a public notice at that point and started scoping this project. So it's been going as the Home in Tacoma Project for about a year and a half now. Really ramped up in fall with the survey and Housing Cafe series and lots of engagement. Planning Commission then developed their public review draft in February and finalized that after several months. And so now we're at the council stage. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Elliot. I do have one technical question. This is something that I'm not sure who to pose this question to, but there were a number of questions that I felt should be answered live about why this doesn't go to a voter referendum. So what is sort of the legal process for considering this change? Could one of you speak to that?
I'm happy to, yeah. And Andrew, raise your hand if you want to field one of these as well. So in our system, the city council makes land use actions and land use decisions, zoning decisions, et cetera. That is the standard practice across Washington and I think probably across the country. And this is under the framework of state planning and state growth management, that authority rests with the city council. And why is that the case? Well, the city council is responsible for taking the time that's needed with the advice of their planning commission and other groups and with input from the community, but to dig deep, understand the issues at a deeper level and make decisions, that it's difficult for everybody to kind of get your mind around. And so the city council makes that decision. It's also beholden on the city council to look at kind of the full process, including for all the stakeholders, not only current residents, but even future residents or people that don't, necessarily participate actively in public policy processes like this. So that is our system. And lastly, I guess the reasons for that, under the state, we are actually required to plan for and accommodate growth. And this has been a major emphasis at the state legislative level as well.
Thank you, Elliot. I have a question about design. And so this is building on, the top response in the poll in terms of what people wanted more information about, but also what they were concerned about. So the question is, how does the city identify character and quality design? So could you just share with folks how those decisions are made internally, in the planning department, as well as how Planning Commission takes that into account?
Do you want to start, Elliot, and I'll finish?
For sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, this is something the city's been thinking about for quite a long time. Here in Tacoma, I've been a planner here for a good number of years now. There was a time when growth was happening pretty slowly here in Tacoma. And I think at that time, I think the city really wanted to try and encourage some development to occur. Well, that has really changed now, and the city is starting to grow a lot faster, as I think we all know. And so there's been this really renewed interest and concern about good design and what that means. So the city has been investing a lot of effort in that, in updating our current design standards. We have an urban design studio, which is looking at expanding the toolkit that the city has for good design. And it's the same with this Home in Tacoma project. Yes, we would be looking at expanding the housing type significantly and expanding design controls, design review, not necessarily through like a design review board, but really making improving our tools to make sure that what gets built is going to fit the neighborhood in terms of the scale, et cetera. So I hope that's answered the question. And what about you, Andrew?
Yeah, you hit on a couple notes, which is the Planning Commission has looked at our urban design studio for like how can we incorporate as part of these types of developments the type of amenities and features and design that actually fit into the character of the neighborhood. And this also sort of hinges around the question of infrastructure questions that you might get, Heidi, where we want to make sure that these developments are addressing the adequate need for park space and pedestrian amenities and traffic signals and what have you, as all part of the overall development of these types of housing. And then, you look at, say, maybe like a district like the historic slope, where there are already like design elements that are applied in that specific district that are supposed to be historic, apply historic preservation to the neighborhood. And, those are sort of tools that the city has to really look at how we can address design deficiencies and what some of these proposals sometimes come to the city, and really massage these projects so that they actually fit within the neighborhood character.
Great, thank you. Elliot, this should be an easy one, and I'm going to kind of tick off some easier, more technical questions, and then jump into some of the I would say things that require a little more of a deeper response. The question is downtown part of the plan?
Good question. Good. Whenever you say it's an easy question, I get nervous because then the pressure's on. Primarily, the answer is no. The focus of this project is in our residential areas. That being said, Tacoma has been working for a long time to promote dense, transit-oriented growth downtown and in our centers located throughout the city. And so that's still the place where we expect most of our growth to happen. And the one way that this project does influence downtown is a place where we could have a lot of affordability opportunities. We could partner with developers there to try to integrate some affordable units into larger scale projects.
Great, thank you. This may be a legal question. It concerns property covenants. So neighborhoods that have homeowners associations or covenants that govern a housing type, would these change at all with this project, with these proposed changes?
Great question. And the answer is no, those are private agreements. And within our legal framework, the city doesn't really get directly involved in those. So you would still have those covenants, and that would restrict what could be built. So short answer is no. It does create opportunity for those to change through time, but again, they are private legal agreements.
Great, thank you. There is a question about property taxes. There were a number of questions expressing concern about potential property tax increases as a result of this proposal. And the question is, how will homeowners, low to moderate income homeowners be able to afford potential property taxes? Or is there any speculation about how much property taxes could go up as a result of the proposal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think people are concerned both about, if something unattractive was built next to their house, maybe that would lower their property values. People don't want that. But at the same time, people don't want, the value of their property to, skyrocket too quickly and then increase the amount that they have to pay. The short answer is that we want to craft this package in a way that it benefits everybody, that it's citywide, so that we're not creating kind of, pockets of areas that would be affected, and so that effect would be across the city and kind of equalized. And then lastly, the city does not control property tax assessments. That's done by Pierce County, and while this needs some further research, property taxes are only supposed to go up at a set rate per year. And so that's actually intended to be a protection from kind of a rapid increase of property taxes. So I think this question does deserve some more research, but we don't anticipate there to be a major spike in property taxes.
So there were a number of questions that were associated with this project's potential to provide more affordable housing. And some of those questions were sort of associated with renters, with low-income renters. So how will this project provide more housing that would accommodate low-income renters' needs? Some of the questions were about home ownership, so concerns that this project may incentivize demolition of affordable ownership units, and that there maybe is not enough emphasis on the ownership side of things, so affordable ownership as well. So I would put those into two questions. The first being on the ownership side, does this project have a goal of increasing ownership? And then secondly, in thinking about rental housing, how might this project be able to accommodate additional rental needs?
Gotcha. I will jump in, but Andrew, raise your hand or go after me. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so in terms of ownership, so this proposal, this package is intended to increase the full range of housing that's available, both rental and ownership opportunities, because rental property is very important. There are a lot of people who either need or prefer to be renters, or at least at certain times or stages of life. Rental properties are very important. In terms of ownership opportunities, those are also very important because they are a pathway to building personal and family wealth that can then be passed on and benefit future generations as well. So this project tries to promote home ownership. Yes, ownership is also a goal of this project, and it does that in several different ways. One, just by allowing smaller infill housing, it could create new ownership opportunities. For example, if you can build an infill house in a location that you could not prior, that's one more place where an ownership opportunity could come into being, and it could also be less expensive, so a lower threshold financially. So just by increasing housing choices, that's part of it. But there are other tools as well. We want to look at, removing barriers that exist. Sometimes it's having to do with insurance rules and things like that. And some of those are in city control, some not. So there's some technical parts to this, but there are lots of things that the city can work on or collaborate with others to try and just make it easier or bring down the cost of separate ownership, even if it's smaller attached units. So that's one part of it. There was a few different aspects to the question. Should I pause and see if do you want to chime in on the ownership piece, Andrew?
I'll just jump in that, one of the things, at least that the commission really recognized, is that we have active displacement of people happening right now based off of market conditions in the city. And really, I look at the Home in Tacoma project as providing, I would say, different types of housing that would create opportunities for folks who couldn't maybe necessarily afford a single family home right off the bat, and maybe enter in the housing market as an owner of one of the types of units that would be potentially part of the low scale or the mid scale types of housing. And so I do see that there is an opportunity here for increasing ownership, but also, as sort of Elliot said earlier in the presentation, or I think it was Jacques, that this isn't necessarily the silver bullet of like affordability when it comes to creating affordable units. There is a definite supply issue within the city. And then the second phase of the project really is like, where do we implement the affordability incentives or requirements that are part of the missing middle or the low scale housing? So those are, that's sort of the key part of where I said like the devil's in the details, is it's going to be how do these units act as affordable units or not, outside of just providing more supply. And so sort of dealing with all those sort of market forces, but also what the city can do to apply, that these units be as affordable as possible under what limited tools it does have, is going to be a key part in creating more home ownership for individuals.
And Heidi, I know that question partially touched on displacement too, or anti-displacement. I'm not sure if that's a hanging question.
Yeah, there was actually, and I'll follow with that. So there are a couple questions about equity, gentrification, the city's intent in increasing equity through this project, and then how does the city expect to respond to gentrification pressures?
Yeah, well, I'll start if that's okay, and just say that, we're all painfully aware that, housing costs are just going up and up, and that's already leading to, displacement and gentrification, just even under the current circumstance. But the problem is that then, without any sort of supply getting created in those neighborhoods, people may really be displaced from the neighborhood. And so one of the core strategy here is just that we can create the opportunity for more housing types, hopefully at a broader range of price points, in each one of our neighborhoods, and that in itself is one of the most important things that the city can do. So if there's someone who is displaced from their house, from their current residence, at least they would then have an opportunity to find something in their same neighborhood. That's purely just on the supply side, but there are also more proactive steps that the city can take. We're developing an anti-displacement strategy as part of this, and there are ways that the city can try to give a leg up to current residents of a neighborhood to find housing in their existing neighborhood. And lastly, similarly with affordable housing, we can take steps to try and make dedicated affordable housing or subsidized affordable housing, to try to target that to people who are in the existing neighborhood. And those are all the types of strategies that we can do. There are many more as well. Things such as promoting financial literacy and trying to remove barriers to home ownership for people. So supply is part of it. There's a lot more to it as well.
Thank you. There's one question about a worry, I would say, about potential concentration of mid-scale development in certain neighborhoods. And then another question about a couple of questions about whether or not this was considered, or a pilot program, like a pilot approach was considered, sort of an approach where you might step through this and try and do a trial approach to see how it works. So I'm curious if I could lump those together and ask about, did the city consider a pilot approach, and is the city worried about concentration or sort of over concentration of these types of units in any one or two neighborhoods?
Yeah, well, I'll start in terms of the pilot approach. In one sense, we have been trying pilot approaches over the past few years, such as the ADUs, such as the infill pilot program. We've been doing things to pilot missing middle housing for a while now. It's demonstrated that there's a lot of interest and a lot of demand out there. For example, the ADUs program has taken off a lot since those changes were put in place about 1.5 years ago. So in that sense, we've been piloting. At the beginning of the Home in Tacoma project, what we were hearing, I think, as staff and planning commission, was that council was really perceiving a housing crisis, and we were hearing that from community members as well. And so the range of responses that the commission considered were more bold. They really looked at incremental change versus all the way up to transformational change, and kind of fell somewhere in between those two. But it's certainly a big proposal. It could still be moderated as part of that phase 2. So even if council says, yes, this is a great vision, we want to move in this direction, they could phase in zoning changes. So there's still a lot of piloting that could take place even under this proposal. So those are some of my perspectives.
I'll sort of add to the question about the overconcentration of potential missing middle in maybe one or a few different neighborhoods. Is the Planning Commission really looked at, and this is going back also to sort of the equity question that you asked earlier, of really providing housing types throughout the entire city, these missing middle housing types, and providing those opportunities for people to potentially live in those neighborhoods if that housing was developed. There's not a lot of things that we can do to control what might be one neighbor, the development of one neighborhood versus another. But the strategy was overall to have it be an equitable process, and overall create the opportunity for more type of this type of housing. And so that strategy is what we sort of employed. But as far as it being concentrated in one area versus another, it's just one of the tools that we don't ultimately as a city get to control where housing ultimately gets built when it comes to somebody who wants to do a project and propose a project. And I think through Elliot's question with the answering about the pilot programs, I will just say from my experience seeing the number of, say, detached accessory dwelling units that's been built throughout the city, it's very much changed when it was a pilot project versus what it is now. And I think in order to really sort of get a good idea of what the missing middle housing is going to be is really providing an opportunity for it to be built outside of the pilot, just because the pilots don't always garner a lot of success from really getting a true idea of you know, how many units are going to be built when developers or individuals that want to make these units don't, you know, it may take 2-3 years for them to get a proposal, and those regulations might change. And so they won't ultimately be able to really invest in developing that type of project. And that's sort of what we saw with the detached accessory dwelling unit pilot project. So hopefully that answered some of that question.
Thank you, Andrew. There are a couple of questions about other types of property. So has the city considered like conversion of a vacant or aging commercial or industrial? Might that be a solution to some of the affordable housing challenges? So Elliot, could you speak to whether or not that is part of this project, or if the city has other mechanisms to maybe facilitate conversions of those types of properties into needed residential?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, particularly now after COVID, and we're all still, many of us are working from home, you know, how is that going to change, you know, for example, office and retail space throughout the city? And we already know there are some places where, you know, commercial structures or others are underused or sitting vacant. And so can those be housing? There are ways in which the city's already trying to support that. If they're located in one of our designated centers, you know, we have a lot of kind of tools that we try to encourage redevelopment to take place in those types of areas. You know, through this project, the commission really focused on residential areas, but also recognize that there is another need that we should be looking at kind of at the same time to work on that, such as along commercial corridors. So very good issue and an important one for us to work on.
There have been a number of questions about walkability and density, and the potential concern that that adding more density could create more traffic. And so how is the city thinking about the potential for development to occur in sort of less walkable areas?
I guess I'll start with that. Is what we sort of talked about a little bit earlier with the sort of the urban design studio. I think that obviously becomes a design aesthetic to like how many units are being proposed, you know, what are some of, you know, as part of any individual project that comes through the city, it'll naturally have an environmental review for some of those things like traffic impacts, and really making sure that we really change the way that we think as far as the design of these facilities, and making sure that they're making the types of infrastructure and the street improvements that can actually make these, you know, all of our communities safe for walkability. But you know, walkability is a two sort of edged sword, where it's like, you know, you do get more people and more traffic in those areas, but with that density, you are also creating the opportunity for types of development to occur where you wouldn't even necessarily need a car, or you'd be able to rely on frequent amounts of more frequent transit if the density supported that transit to be more frequent. And so that's sort of how you balance that walkability question.
Thanks, Elliot. We've got about 5 minutes to go here. So I'll take a couple other questions that I see here, but I do want to remind folks of the project website, which is Home in Tacoma. The public meeting, the city council meetings that are occurring on July 13th, not the 14th. I misspoke earlier. And then there was a question, Andrew, about planning commissions and whether or not those meetings are open to the public. So I believe that the city council meeting next week on July 13th is Zoom format, correct, Elliot? It's not in person.
Correct.
And then I do believe, Andrew, and correct me if I'm wrong, that planning commission meetings are also open to the public.
Correct. We've been in the pandemic meeting virtually, and our agendas are published. You can simply look for Tacoma Planning Commission and see our agendas and the ways to join the meeting. And we do take public comment, and we meet every first and third Wednesday typically, if we haven't rescheduled a meeting. So they are definitely very public oriented, and when we had our hearing, we had quite a few of the members of the public, I think, participate in this process. So feel free to join. We're going to continue as the commission to continue to dive into the second phase if council ultimately moves in that direction to have a second phase and consider this project. But we're always addressing all the different land use changes that are occurring within the city, and we definitely rely on public comment to help make our recommendations to the city council.
And Andrew, where would people get more information about Planning Commission? Just there's a website, they could Google that and it would pop up the website with your meetings.
Yeah, I might be able to send you the link, but you can definitely Google it and see, the Tacoma Planning Commission, and you'll see printed agendas that will, you can access the meetings through Zoom.
Okay.
If you just go to cityoftacoma.org/planning, there you'll see our department webpage, and one of the first options is the Planning Commission.
Great, thank you. In the last couple of minutes that we have here, there were a number of questions about how this project is coordinated with other affordable housing efforts. So these questions took people asked about land trusts. They asked about how to ensure that the housing that was developed might be restricted for low-income people, coordination with nonprofit housing developers. So Elliot, could you speak to how this project is related to Jacques' project, and sort of how the planning side and affordable housing and program side interact? There was also a question about whether or not this was associated with new federal funds. So along in the same vein.
Right. Well, short answer, in terms of federal funds, I think that would be great. The city, I'm sure, could make good use of new federal funds for affordable housing. I guess I've heard sort of rumors about that, but that's not kind of a core strategy here, unfortunately, although fingers crossed that we could have more funding for housing action citywide. But in terms of how Home in Tacoma fits with this whole package of housing actions, that's what Jacques was giving us a taste of in the beginning of the program, or the presentation. And there's just a lot to it. This is a complex problem where there are lots of reasons why people may struggle to find housing that they can afford or that works for them. And there's a range of different things that the city can do. Some of them are more market-based, such as the predominant thrust of this Home in Tacoma project, and just allowing more choices and kind of making the housing rules more responsive. But other ones are more funding-based or program-based, where maybe somebody just is facing some barriers that they need a little bit of help to overcome in order to access housing, or perhaps their income is just not high enough to really find housing on the open market, and so they would turn to nonprofits like the Tacoma Housing Authority and others to provide. So it's a complex answer, but the city's trying to look at the whole situation, and Jacques can tell you more.
Yeah, I would say, you know, when you talk about what a city can do to address the housing crisis, we really do have a limited set of tools in our tool belt because our housing is done mostly by private industry, right? For-profit developers are the main builders of housing. And so when you think about the tools that the city has in our tool belt, there are some things that are within our direct control that we're taking action on. Those are things like using our surplus land and prioritizing affordable housing as a primary use for the use of that surplus land, right? That's something that we have direct control over. There are other things that we can use limited city dollars to try to leverage with other dollars to create more affordable development and more housing units. And those are processes like our request or our notice of funding applications for developers. I mentioned at the very beginning that council passed a new 0.1% sales tax that's going to create about $3 million per year that will be able to invest in low-income housing, permanent supportive housing, and permanent supportive housing services. And I shouldn't say permanent supportive housing, supportive housing and supportive housing services, because we need all of those options, permanent and temporary. So there are some things that we can directly use our money to leverage. And then there are other things that we have very little control over, like who is building private market rate housing. And one of the few tools that we have to try to influence that is the zoning and development regulations that the Home in Tacoma is taking into account. And so for those of you that are asking, you know, do we vet private developers? No, because that's not something that cities are able to do unless it's city land. We can put design requirements as a vetting process, right? So there are things that we do like design requirements to ensure that nobody can just come in and build whatever they want. But all of that's really to say that creating these changes to low density zoning are really intended as a way to remove artificial barriers so that private development can partner and create more units of housing outside of the direct control of the city. So I hope that clarifies why this fits into that larger puzzle. This is not one of those things that the city has direct control over what develops where. This isn't even one of those situations where we can use our money to leverage development in a particular place or in a particular way. This is really creating a policy that creates the conditions for housing to be built in a different way that creates more public benefit. And just as a quick illustrator, and not everybody needs to see it that way, but that is the theory of change here. When you think about the costs to developers, right? There's very little that we can do at the city to reduce the costs for developers. There are things like reducing permitting time and permitting fees that we've looked at with our permit advisory task force. But outside of those direct actions that we have with developers, there's very little we can do to control the cost of land, the cost of materials. I don't know if folks have heard about the cost of lumber during the pandemic, but that has been a huge, huge barrier to developers being able to build at the pace that they want to. And so we can't control the price of lumber, but what we can do is change our zoning so that if you built the same building envelope with roughly the same amount of wood, instead of building a 2,500 one unit that you have to sell, you now have the option, the opportunity, not the requirement, but the opportunity to split that house into two 1,250 square foot units that would use roughly the same amount of land, the same amount of materials, and potentially roughly the same amount of labor. So if you think about it that way in terms of the costs to private developers, this is one of the few tools that we have to try to reduce some of those costs, or to think about it a different way, to increase the opportunity to think about costs differently or to spread those costs out differently to create more affordability. So it is certainly not on its own, but it is in partnership with all of those other actions that are more directly in our control or could use public money to leverage those outcomes that we're trying to see. Thanks, Elliot.
Such a great answer, Jacques. Thank you for walking through that. When we talk about the affordability side, I always just want to, I can't resist the urge to just point out that it's also about being responsive to input that we've heard over years. You know, right now we have a set of housing rules that really does kind of limit choices. It says one housing type is the housing type that can be built throughout most of our neighborhoods. And another part of this, in addition to affordability, has just been housing choice, allowing people to make choices that may work better for them or for their family over time. And it is about choice. This is not about eliminating houses by any means. It's actually about creating more ways that people can have a house, or perhaps a smaller attached housing type that has many of those same benefits. So I had to chime in and offer that as my last thought here.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Elliot. I just want to be cognizant of people's time here. We're a little bit over. The last question that I would like somebody to respond to is whether or not this recording will be made available and where. And I see Elliot nodding his head. I'm assuming it'll be on the project website. Where everything lives. So stay tuned for that. There is a similar meeting on Thursday night. It will focus on the Midscale primarily, but we'll have a very similar format with the Q&A. Thank you everybody for your attendance. I appreciate all of your very, very thoughtful questions. We have captured all of those. So if we didn't get the chance to answer them verbally, we will definitely be scrolling through and taking a look at those. So I appreciate everything that you've typed in. I know that's a lot of work typed in the chat. I will ask Margaret if there was any of the Spanish speakers who were on who wanted to type in a question or ask a question and we didn't get the opportunity to hear from them. I don't see any there. So with that, I'll go ahead and close the meeting. Thanks everybody for your attendance again, for your thoughtful questions and comments. We will certainly take those into consideration. And Elliot, any closing comments or other than have a good night?
Just that I know this is somewhat of a limited format here. We can't meet in person and not quite yet anyway, hopefully soon, but we're gonna post this. We're gonna do an FAQ, frequently asked questions, kind of an update based on not only what we talked about, but some of the questions I'm sure we did not get to. And so just please stay tuned for that. We'll get stuff posted on the webpage as quick as we can, because again, the whole purpose here is just to give you the information and then you can make your voice heard with council by next Tuesday, July 13th. Thank you.
Thanks everybody and have a nice night.